The lawyer's office smelled like fresh paper and expensive coffee. I sat in a leather chair too soft for a man like me, my hands folded in my lap, watching my wife sign her name on page after page. Her name was Diane. She was the CEO of a logistics company she built from a single warehouse into a business worth more money than I could count. I was Walter, 61 years old, retired army mechanic. I fixed things. I didn't build empires. The lawyer slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward me. His name was Mr. Halloran. He had a tie so tight it looked like it was trying to strangle him. Mr. Reyes, this is the prenuptial agreement, he said, not looking at me. Whitfield's assets, business holdings, and future earnings remain solely hers in the event of a divorce. You would retain your personal property only. Diane didn't look at me either. She was looking at her phone. Scrolling through an email like this was just another item on her calendar between board meetings. I want a prenup, she had told me 3 weeks earlier, standing in our kitchen with her arms crossed. I'm not risking my future on you. I remember the way she said it. Flat, practical, like she was talking about insurance on a car. I had nodded. Smart, I said. She looked surprised for half a second, like she expected an argument. I didn't give her one. Now, sitting in that office, I picked up the pen. It was heavier than it should have been. Gold-plated, probably worth more than the watch on my wrist. You don't want to read it first? Mr. Halloran asked, adjusting his glasses. I trust her, I said. Diane finally looked up from her phone. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Maybe guilt, maybe surprise. I couldn't tell anymore. We had been married 8 months, and already I felt like I was reading a stranger. I signed every page. My signature was small and steady, the same signature I had used to sign discharge papers from the Army 32 years ago, the same one I used to sign the deed to my house before I ever met her. Nobody in that room asked me what I owned. Nobody asked about the acreage in Montana that had been in my family since 1954. Nobody asked about the patent I still held from my years designing hydraulic systems for the military, the one that a defense contractor had been quietly paying me royalties on for over a decade. Nobody asked about the small apartment building in Austin that my late wife and I had bought in 1998, the one that now brought in steady rental income every single month. They saw an old man in a worn blazer, sitting next to a woman who ran a company with 400 employees. And they made an assumption. The assumption was that I had nothing. The assumption was that I needed her. I let them believe it. Diane and I met at a fundraiser for veterans 18 months earlier. She wasn't there for the cause. She was there because her company sponsored the event, and her PR team told her it would look good. I was there because I actually served, and one of the younger vets asked me to say a few words. I remember standing at the podium, talking about a friend I lost in Fallujah, and looking out to see a woman in a sharp navy suit who wasn't checking her phone. She was listening, really listening. Her eyes were red by the time I finished. Afterward, she found me by the bar. That was the most honest thing anyone has said at one of these events in years. She told me. I liked her immediately, not because of her money. I didn't even know how much she was worth until months later, when a magazine profile mentioned her net worth in the headline. I liked the way she asked questions and actually waited for the answers. I liked that she laughed too loud at her own jokes. We dated for a year. She met my daughter, Claire, who lived 2 hours away and worked as a nurse. She met my old army buddies at our monthly breakfast. She seemed to fit into my small, quiet life the way water fits into a glass. Then we got engaged and something changed. It started small. She began asking about my finances in ways that felt more like an audit than a conversation. What was my monthly income? Did I have debt? Did I own my truck outright? I answered honestly, but I noticed she never asked follow-up questions. She never asked why a retired mechanic owned 400 acres of Montana land free and clear. She never asked why I didn't seem worried about money. I think she had already decided who I was. A retired vet living on a pension and Social Security, marrying up, grateful, simple, safe. Her mother, Eleanor, said it out loud at Thanksgiving dinner 6 weeks before the wedding. Diane, honey, you built all this yourself, Eleanor said, cutting her turkey with sharp, precise movements. You need to protect it. Men like Walter, no offense, they can get comfortable. I sat there in silence, a glass of water in my hand, and said nothing. Claire, sitting beside me, put her hand on my knee under the table. She knew. She had seen the deed to the Montana land. She had seen the patent paperwork. She knew exactly what her father was worth, and she knew I wasn't going to wreck anyone in that room. "He's not like that," Diane said, defending me, but there was a hesitation in her voice. A small crack. Enough to tell me she had already been thinking about it before her mother said a word. 2 weeks later, she brought up the prenup for the first time. It was raining the night she told me. I remember because I was standing at the kitchen window watching the water run down the glass, and she came up behind me with a folder in her hand. "I talked to a lawyer," she said. Her voice was careful, like she was diffusing a bomb. "I want a prenup. I'm not risking my future on you." I turned around. She was watching my face closely, waiting for anger, waiting for hurt feelings, maybe even waiting for me to walk away. I gave her none of that. "Smart," I said, and I meant it, because in that moment, I understood something clearly. She wasn't protecting her money from a man who loved her. She was protecting her money from a version of me that existed only in her head, and in her mother's head. A version built entirely out of assumptions. Nobody in that family had ever asked me a real question about my life before deciding what kind of man I was, so I let the assumption stand. Claire called me that night, furious. "Dad, are you going to sign it? Just like—" "Yes," I said. "They think you're broke," she said. "They think you need her money." "I know," I said. "Doesn't that bother you?" I looked out at the rain again before answering. "What bothers me," I said slowly, "is that she's about to marry me, and she still doesn't know who I am. That bothers me a lot more than a piece of paper." Claire went quiet on the other end of the line. She understood what I meant, even if she didn't like it. The wedding happened 3 weeks later. Small ceremony, just close family and a few friends. Diane looked happy. I looked happy too, and it wasn't an act. Despite everything, I loved her. I still do, but love and understanding are two different things, and I was starting to realize my wife didn't understand me at all. She thought she married a man with nothing to lose. She had no idea what I was actually protecting by staying quiet. 6 months into the marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived at the house. It came from a law firm in Washington, D.C. Diane was at work. I opened it alone at the kitchen table, and what it said changed everything. The defense contractor that had been licensing my hydraulic patent for 12 years was being acquired by a much larger company. As part of the acquisition, all existing patent royalty agreements were being reviewed, and mine, the one nobody in Diane's family knew existed, was about to increase in value by a number so large I had to read it 3 times to believe it. I sat there at the kitchen table, letter in my hands, and I thought about the prenup sitting in a drawer in my office. The one that said her assets stayed hers, and I kept only what I already owned. Nobody had asked what that was. I heard Diane's car pull into the driveway. I folded the letter and slid it into my jacket pocket, and I stood up to greet my wife the same way I had every day since we married. Calm, steady, quiet, but something inside me had shifted. Because in 3 weeks, Eleanor was hosting a family gathering to celebrate Diane closing the biggest deal of her career. And I had just decided it was time everyone found out exactly who they had been underestimating. The rain had stopped by the morning after the letter arrived, but I hadn't slept much. I kept thinking about the number on that page, and about Diane's mother saying men like Walter at the dinner table like I was a category instead of a person. Diane came downstairs in her robe, hair still damp from the shower, scrolling through emails before she'd even poured her coffee. That was normal for her. She worked before she was fully awake most mornings. "You're up early," she said, not really looking at me. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Everything okay?" I almost told her then. I almost pulled the letter out of my jacket pocket and set it on the counter between us. But something stopped me. I wanted to see how far the assumptions would go before I corrected them. I told myself it was curiosity. If I'm honest, it was something closer to a test. "Everything's fine," I said. "Just old habits. Used to wake up early for physical training. Body never forgot." She smiled at that, the kind of soft smile she used to give me before the wedding. Before the prenup, before her mother's comments started living in the back of my mind like a splinter. "I like that about you," she said. "You're steady. Not much rattles you." If she only knew, Claire came to visit that weekend. She worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital 2 hours away, so I didn't see her often. But she always managed to find time when something was bothering her father. She could read me the way her mother used to. Before we lost her to cancer 9 years earlier, we sat on the back porch while Diane was on a work call inside. Claire had a cup of coffee in her hands, and she was studying my face the way nurses study vital signs. "You've got that look," she said. "What look?" "The one you had before you told Mom about the transfer to Fort Bragg. The one where you've already made a decision and you're just figuring out how to say it out loud." I laughed a little. She wasn't wrong. The patent got picked up in an acquisition, I said. "Royalties are about to change, significantly." Claire's eyebrows went up. "How significantly?" I told her the number from the letter. She nearly spilled her coffee. "Dad." She set the cup down carefully, like her hands weren't steady enough to hold it anymore. "That's more than Diane makes in bonuses most years." "I know. Are you going to tell her?" I looked out at the yard, at the old oak tree I'd planted the year Claire was born. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Every time I think about telling her, I think about Eleanor's face at Thanksgiving. Men like Walter, that's what she called me, not by name, by category." Claire was quiet for a moment. "So what? You're going to punish them by staying quiet?" "No," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not trying to punish anyone. I just want to know if she loves the man, or the story she's built about the man. There's a difference." That night, after Claire left, I went into my office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Underneath some old insurance paperwork was a photo album I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of my first wife, Rosa, and me standing in front of the Austin apartment building the week we closed on it. She was smiling so wide in that photo, both of us young and terrified and proud. Rosa had been the one with the head for real estate. I fixed engines. She read contracts for fun on Sunday afternoons. Together we built something small but solid, brick by brick, tenant by tenant, over 20 years of marriage. When she died, I kept the building because letting it go would have felt like letting go of her. Diane didn't know about Rosa's role in any of it. She knew I'd been married before. She knew my first wife passed away. But she never asked the details, and I never offered them, because grief isn't something you hand to someone who hasn't earned it yet. I ran my thumb over the edge of the photograph and thought about how much of my life Diane had never bothered to ask about, not out of cruelty. I didn't think she was cruel. I think she was busy and tired and trained by a lifetime of being underestimated herself to assume that anyone quieter than her had less going on beneath the surface. Maybe I was proving her right by staying silent, or maybe I was giving her the chance to prove herself wrong. 2 days later, I drove out to see my own attorney, a woman named Priya Nasser, who had handled Rosa's estate and my patent licensing for 15 years. Her office was nothing like Mr. Halloran's glass tower. It was a converted house near the courthouse, with a wooden desk older than she was. "Walter," she said, waving me into a chair. "Been a while. What's going on?" I laid it all out. The marriage, the prenup, the letter from the patent acquisition. Priya listened without interrupting, the way she always did, tapping her pen against a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You signed a prenup that only protects her assets," she said slowly. "Did you disclose your holdings before signing?" Nobody asked. "That's not really how it's supposed to work, Walter. Full disclosure protects everyone." She sighed. "But if you signed without hiding anything they specifically asked for, and the agreement only restricts her assets and your future division, then legally, your patent royalties, the Montana land, and the Austin property are still entirely yours. The prenup doesn't touch what's already in your name. If anything, it protects you too. You keep what's yours. She keeps what's hers. So I'm not in trouble." "No," Priya said. "But I want to ask you something else. Why does it feel like you're more worried about being underestimated than about the money?" I sat with that question for a moment. "Because being underestimated by strangers doesn't hurt," I said finally. "Being underestimated by your own wife does." A week later, Diane called me from the office in a panic. Her father, a quiet man named Robert, who I'd always liked more than the rest of her family, had suffered a mild heart attack. I dropped everything and drove her to the hospital myself, my hands steady on the wheel while hers shook in her lap. We sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. Diane didn't touch her phone once. For the first time since I'd known her, I watched every wall she carried at work simply fall away. She cried into my shoulder, and I held her, and neither of us said a word about money or prenups or assumptions. Robert pulled through. When the doctor gave us the news, Diane collapsed against me, relief shaking through her whole body. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for not needing me to explain anything. You just showed up." "That's what you do for family," I said. She pulled back and looked at me, really looked at me, the way she used to before the wedding planning consumed her. "I know I've been distant," she said. "The prenup, the way my mother talks about you, I know it isn't fair. You've never once made me feel like you wanted anything from me." For a moment, I almost told her everything: the letter, the land, the building in Austin. But Eleanor walked in right then, and the moment closed like a door. Eleanor took one look at me standing beside her exhausted daughter and said, "Walter, you should go get some coffee for everyone. You're good at things like that." Diane didn't correct her. She was too tired to notice. I got the coffee. 3 weeks passed. The acquisition finalized. The new royalty payment hit my account on a Thursday morning, while Diane was in a board meeting downtown. I stared at the number on my banking app for a long time before closing my laptop. That Saturday was the celebration dinner at Eleanor's house, the one honoring Diane closing the biggest deal of her career, a merger worth nearly $200 million for her company. The whole family would be there. Eleanor had hired a caterer. Diane's business partners were invited. It was, by every measure, a night about her success. I put on my good blazer, the navy one, and drove Diane to her mother's house. She looked beautiful and exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from winning something enormous. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said in the car. "I know these dinners aren't really your scene." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant that too. What she didn't know was that I had something folded in my jacket pocket. Not the old patent letter this time. Something new. A single sheet of paper from Priya's office, finalized 2 days earlier, that I planned to set on the table before the night was over. Eleanor met us at the door with a tight smile aimed mostly at her daughter. "There's my brilliant girl," she said, pulling Diane into a hug and glancing past her shoulder at me like an afterthought. "Walter, good, you're here. We're short a chair. Can you grab one from the garage?" I smiled, set my jacket carefully on the hook by the door, and went to get the chair. Some assumptions, I had learned, needed to be dismantled slowly, in front of the right audience, at exactly the right moment. Tonight was going to be that moment. The dining room at Eleanor's house was full by 7. Diane's business partners, 2 board members, a handful of cousins, and Robert, still moving carefully after his heart attack, but insisting on being there for his daughter's celebration. The table was set with the good china, the kind Eleanor only brought out when she wanted people to notice. I sat near the end of the table, next to Claire, who had driven in for the occasion despite a shift the next morning. She squeezed my hand under the tablecloth once, a silent question. I gave her a small nod. Not yet. Eleanor stood and raised her glass early in the meal, before dessert, before anyone had really settled into conversation. "To my daughter," she said, "who built an empire out of nothing but grit and brains. Diane, you didn't need anyone to hand you a thing. You did this yourself." Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine too. It was true. Diane had built something remarkable, and I was proud of her, genuinely proud, in a way that had nothing to do with what I was carrying, folded in my jacket pocket. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "And I'll say this," she continued, her eyes sliding toward me for just a moment. "It takes real security to build something like this, while also being generous enough to share it. Diane didn't have to bring anyone else into this life. She chose to." The table laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that pretends to be a joke while drawing blood underneath. Diane's face flushed. "Mom," she said quietly. "What? I'm complimenting you." "You're complimenting me by insulting my husband," Diane said, her voice sharper than I expected. I put my hand on her knee under the table, a small gesture. "It's fine." She glanced at me, unconvinced, but let it go. Later, during dessert, one of Diane's board members, a younger man named Trent with an expensive watch and an opinion about everything, leaned across the table toward me with the kind of curiosity people show when they're trying to categorize you. "So, Walter, what did you do before you retired?" "Army mechanic," I said. "Hydraulics, mostly. Some systems design work toward the end." Trent nodded, already losing interest. "Must be nice being taken care of now." He said it with a smile, like it was a compliment, but I'd heard enough versions of that sentence over the past year to recognize it for what it was. Diane's jaw tightened beside me. "Trent, what? I just meant. I know what you meant." Diane snapped, harder than the moment called for. The table went quiet. Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. Eleanor busied herself with her wine glass, pretending not to have heard, though I knew she had orchestrated this exact tension all evening without ever raising her own voice. I could have said something then. I could have corrected the room in a single sentence. Instead, I stood up calmly and said, "I'll go check on the coffee," and walked toward the kitchen because I wasn't ready yet. I wanted to see how far this would go without me stepping in. Claire followed me into the kitchen a minute later, closing the door behind her. "Dad, this is insane," she whispered. "They've spent the entire night treating you like some kind of charity case Diane took in. Why haven't you said anything?" "Because Diane hasn't said anything either," I said quietly, pouring coffee into a carafe with steady hands. "That's what I'm watching." Claire's face fell a little, understanding what I meant. "You're testing her. I'm giving her the chance to defend me the way I've defended her every single time, without needing a receipt for it. And if she doesn't?" I didn't answer that. I didn't know the answer yet. When I carried the coffee tray back into the dining room, the conversation had shifted, but not for the better. Eleanor was now talking about the house Diane and I lived in, a modest 4-bedroom that Diane had purchased before we married. "I keep telling Diane she should update the kitchen," Eleanor was saying, "but I suppose with everything else going on, some projects have to wait. We like the kitchen the way it is," Diane said, a little tired now, the fight draining out of her voice. "Of course, dear, it's just, Walter's pension only stretches so far, doesn't it? No shame in that. Plenty of men his age are on a fixed income." That was the moment Diane finally turned to her mother with something sharp behind her eyes. "Mom, stop, please, you've been doing this all night." "Doing what?" "I'm simply being practical. Someone in this family has to be. You're humiliating him at my own celebration dinner." Eleanor set down her fork with a small, precise click against the china. "I'm protecting you, Diane. Someone has to, since you signed a man 20 years older than you into your life, without knowing the first thing about his finances beyond a pension statement." The room went silent. Even Trent had the sense to look down at his plate. I set the coffee carafe down on the table, slowly, deliberately. My hands were steady. I had spent 32 years learning how to keep my hands steady when everything around me was falling apart. "Eleanor," I said, my voice calm, "I think it's time I said something." Diane looked up at me, something like fear crossing her face, though I couldn't tell if she was afraid of what I'd say, or afraid of what her mother had already said. Robert set his water glass down and watched me with quiet, careful attention, the way a man watches a storm forming on the horizon. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded paper Priya had prepared for me. I didn't open it yet. I just held it, letting the weight of the moment settle over the table. "I signed the prenuptial agreement without reading a single page," I said. "Some of you probably heard about that. I imagine it confirmed something you'd already decided about me, that I had nothing to lose, that I was just grateful to be here." Nobody spoke. Diane's hand found mine under the table, gripping it tightly. "The truth is," I continued, "nobody in this family ever asked me a real question about my life. Not once, in 18 months. You asked about my pension. You asked about my truck payment. Nobody asked about the 12-year patent licensing agreement with the Department of Defense that just got acquired by a company 3 times its size. Nobody asked about the 400 acres of land in Montana that's been in my family since 1954. Nobody asked about the apartment building in Austin that's paid its own mortgage off twice over." Eleanor's face had gone pale, her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. Diane turned to look at me full, now her eyes wide, searching my face like she was seeing me for the first time. "Walter," she said quietly, "what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I let all of you believe I needed this family's money," I said, "because I wanted to see who would defend me when they thought I had nothing to offer in return. And for a long time tonight, the answer was nobody." I set the folded paper down on the table in front of Diane, still unopened. "That's a letter from my attorney," I said. "It has the current valuation of everything I own. I was going to hand it to you privately tonight, after dinner, but your mother made that difficult." The room was completely silent now except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the sound of Diane's fingers trembling as she reached for the paper. She unfolded it slowly. Her eyes moved down the page once, then again, like she couldn't trust the numbers the first time. Her face went white. "Walter," she whispered, "this can't be right." "It's right," I said quietly. Eleanor set her wineglass down so hard it nearly cracked. "That's impossible," she said, though her voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. Diane looked up from the page, and there were tears in her eyes now. though I couldn't tell yet whether they were tears of shock, guilt, or something else entirely. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out, and that was when Robert, quiet the entire evening, finally spoke from the end of the table, his voice low and steady. "Diane," he said, "I think you and Walter need to have a very long conversation tonight." The drive home was silent. Diane sat in the passenger seat with the folded paper in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of it over and over, like she needed to keep touching it to believe it was real. I kept my eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, giving her the space to speak first. It started raining again somewhere around the 3rd mile. A soft, steady rain that blurred the streetlights into long gold streaks against the windshield. Diane finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was smaller than that. Hurt. "I tried a few times," I said. "The night in the hospital waiting room, I almost told you everything. But then your mother walked in, and the moment passed." "That's not an answer, Walter. You had 18 months. I pulled into our driveway and put the truck in park before answering. The rain drummed steadily on the roof. "You're right," I said. "It's not a full answer. The truth is, I wanted to see who you thought I was when you believed I had nothing. And for a long time, Diane, I didn't like the answer." She flinched like I'd struck her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you let your mother call me a financial risk to my face for 18 months, and you never once corrected her." "Not really. You'd tell her to stop, and then you'd let it go. I understood you were tired and busy, and that fighting your mother has never been easy for you. But somewhere in all of that, I started to feel like a line item you were managing instead of a husband you were proud of." Diane's eyes filled again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. "That's not who I wanted to be," she said. I've spent my whole life proving I didn't need anyone. My father built his hardware business from nothing, and my mother spent 30 years telling him he'd never be good enough, and I swore I'd never let a man make me feel small the way she made him feel. So when I met you, someone kind, someone steady, someone who didn't care about my money, I panicked. I thought, what if this is the one thing I can't control? So I tried to control it with a piece of paper. We sat in the driveway for a long moment, rain sliding down the windshield, neither of us moving toward the house. "I need you to understand something," I said. "I didn't marry you for your company or your money, and I never once needed either. I have my own. I've had it the whole time. I let the assumption stand because I wanted to know if you loved the man or the story your family built about him. Tonight for a while I got my answer, and it wasn't the one I wanted. And now?" Diane asked quietly. "Now I want to hear what you have to say, not your mother." "You." Diane wiped her eyes and turned to face me fully in the dim light of the dashboard. "I love you," she said, "not because of what's in that letter. I loved you before I knew any of it, and honestly, some part of me is scared that knowing it changes something between us makes it feel less pure somehow. But I am so sorry, Walter. I let my mother's voice get louder in my head than my own. I let her convince me that protecting my company meant protecting myself from you, when the truth is, you were never the threat. I was too afraid to trust my own judgment." I reached over and took her hand. "I believe you," I said, "but I need things to be different going forward. I need you to defend me in that dining room the way I've defended you every single day since we met. I need you to ask me real questions about my life, instead of assuming you already know the answers." "I will," she said. "I promise." We went inside, and Diane made tea, her hands still a little unsteady on the kettle. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first read the letter about the patent acquisition weeks earlier, and I told her everything. Rosa. The apartment building in Austin, bought in 1998 with money we'd saved for a decade. The Montana land passed down from my grandfather, 400 acres of untouched forest and river frontage that a developer had been trying to buy for years. The patent, born out of a problem I'd solved almost by accident while repairing hydraulic lifts for the military, one that had quietly paid me royalties for over a decade and had just multiplied in value overnight. Deanne listened to all of it without interrupting. The way she used to listen to me at that veterans fundraiser 18 months earlier, like every word actually mattered. "You could have told any of this to my mother," Diane said finally. "You could have shut her down in an instant this whole time." "I could have," I agreed. "But it wouldn't have solved the real problem. The real problem was never what your family thought of my bank account. It was what you thought of me underneath all of it." She nodded slowly, understanding settling into her face like a weight finally set down. I need to talk to my mother, she said. Tomorrow, not you, me. The next morning, Diane called an emergency meeting, not with her mother but with her own legal team and mine. She sat across from Priya and Mr. Halloran in a conference room downtown, and she said something I hadn't expected. I want to amend the prenup, Diane said. I want it to reflect both of our assets fairly, and I want a clause added that protects Walter's holdings the same way mine are protected. What we had before wasn't a partnership. It was a hedge. I don't want a hedge anymore. Mr. Halloran looked uncomfortable, glancing at me like he expected resistance. I gave him none. I appreciate that, I said. But I want to be honest with you both. I never needed the prenup to protect me. What I needed was for my wife to see me as an equal, not a liability. If we're amending anything, I want it to reflect that we're building something together now, not just protecting what we each brought into the marriage. Priya smiled slightly, the kind of smile lawyers give when a difficult case suddenly becomes simple. I think we can draft something that satisfies both of you, she said. Diane confronted her mother 3 days later, at Eleanor's house, without me there. She told me about it that evening. Sitting on our back porch under the same oak tree, Claire and I had talked beneath weeks before. I told her that every comment she made about you, for the last year and a half, was a comment about my judgment, Diane said, because I chose you. And every time she called you a financial risk, she was really saying she didn't trust me to choose a good man. I told her that stops now. How did she take it? Not well at first, she cried. Said she was only trying to protect me the way nobody protected her from Dad's early struggles. But I think for the first time she actually heard me. I told her the truth, Walter, about the land, the patent, the building in Austin. She went quiet for a long time after that. I think she's still trying to reconcile the man she dismissed at every dinner with the man who quietly built a life more secure than half the people at that table. And Trent? The board member? Diane almost smiled. I had a private word with him too, professionally. He won't be making comments like that again, not if he wants to keep his seat on my board. Robert called me himself a week later, asking if I'd come by for coffee while Diane was at work. I found him in his study, looking stronger than he had in the hospital, a stack of business magazines on the table beside him. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I sat at that table for 18 months and let my wife treat you like you were lucky to be there. I should have said something long before you had to say it yourself. You don't owe me anything, Robert. I do, he said firmly. Eleanor built her whole identity around the idea that women have to fight for respect in this family. Because I struggled for years before the hardware business took off. She spent 30 years making sure nobody ever looks down on Diane the way people look down on us. I think somewhere along the way, she decided the best way to protect Diane was to attack anyone who came near her, instead of trusting Diane's judgment. It's not right, but I understand where it came from. I nodded slowly. I understand people protecting the ones they love in strange, misguided ways, I said. I did something similar myself, staying quiet for so long. I wanted to protect my own pride, I think more than I wanted to admit. Robert studied me for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. You're a good man, Walter. I should have said that a long time ago, too. 3 weeks later, Diane finalized the new agreement with both attorneys present. An agreement built on partnership instead of protection. She held my hand across the conference table when she signed it. And this time, before she signed, she asked me, "Is there anything else I should know about you before I sign this?" I smiled at her, the first real easy smile I'd given in that office. "Just that I love you," I said. "The rest you already know now." 6 months passed. The seasons turned from summer into a mild fall, and our house settled into a rhythm that felt different from the one before. Diane started coming home earlier, not every night, but often enough that it stopped being a surprise. She'd sit at the kitchen table while I made dinner, asking me questions she never used to ask. About the army, about Rosa, about the land in Montana and what I planned to do with it. "I've been thinking," she said one evening, watching me chop vegetables the way I'd done 1,000 times before, "about the land. You said a developer's been after it for years. Offers keep coming. I keep saying no. Why?" I set down the knife and looked at her. "Because it's not about the money. My grandfather cleared that land by hand. My father taught me to fish in that river when I was 7 years old. Some things aren't for sale, no matter the number attached to them. Diane nodded slowly, and I could see her turning something over in her mind. What if we didn't sell it, she said. What if we did something with it instead? A retreat for veterans, maybe. Somewhere quiet, somewhere they could go after coming home. The way you talked about at that fundraiser the night we met, I could put together the business side. You'd know exactly what these guys actually need, better than any consultant I could hire. I hadn't expected that. Diane had spent her whole career building logistics networks and closing deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. I hadn't imagined her wanting to build something quiet, something slow, something that wouldn't show up in a headline. You'd really want to do that? I asked. I want to build something with you, she said. Not next to you, with you. I think I forgot the difference for a while. We spent the following months turning that idea into something real. I drove out to Montana more than once, walking the land with Claire, showing her the exact spot where I'd taught her to fish as a girl, the same spot her grandfather had taught me. Diane came out too, in boots that were clearly new, asking question after question about zoning and construction, and what kind of program would actually help veterans instead of just looking good in a brochure. One afternoon, standing at the edge of the river, with the autumn light slanting gold through the trees, Diane pulled an old photograph out of her jacket pocket. It was one I'd shown her months earlier, of Rosa and me standing in front of the Austin building the week we bought it. I found the original in your desk, she said. I hope that's okay. I had it copied and framed. I thought it belonged somewhere you could see it every day, not hidden in a drawer. I took the frame from her hands, throat tight. Thank you, I said quietly. She built something that's still standing, still working, still taking care of people every single month, Diane said. That's not nothing, Walter. That's a legacy. I think I understand now why you never wanted to explain that to people who wouldn't understand it anyway. Eleanor came to dinner at our house for the first time in early November. It was a small gathering, just the four of us, Robert, Eleanor, Diane, and me. She arrived carrying a bottle of wine and an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something closer to humility than I ever expected from that particular woman. I owe you an apology, Walter, she said, standing awkwardly in our front hallway before we'd even sat down. A real one. Not the kind I've been giving Diane where I explain myself more than I apologize. You don't have to do this, Eleanor. I do, she said firmly, the same way Robert had said it months earlier. I spent 30 years afraid of being the woman standing next to a man people didn't respect. I turned that fear into a weapon and I aimed it at you for a year and a half, and I was wrong. You are, without question, one of the most capable men I've ever met, and I judged you by a pension statement instead of the man standing in front of me. I'm sorry. I extended my hand, and she shook it, and something in the room loosened that had been tight since that first Thanksgiving dinner over a year ago. Apology accepted, I said. Now come inside before the food gets cold. The Veterans Retreat broke ground the following spring. We called it Rosa's Rest, and Diane didn't hesitate for a second when I suggested the name. The first cabins went up along the river, built to house veterans and their families for weeks at a time, free of charge, funded partly by the patent royalties I'd spent a decade collecting quietly, and partly by Diane's company, which now sponsored the project publicly instead of using veterans as a photo opportunity the way it once had at that fundraiser where we met. Trent, the board member with the expensive watch, ended up leaving the company within the year. Diane never told me the full story, but I gathered it had less to do with me and more to do with a pattern of behavior that had finally caught up with him. Priya and Mr. Halloran worked together to finalize the last of the paperwork for the retreat's nonprofit status, and standing in that same glass office where I'd once signed page after page without reading a word, I signed again. This time, Diane's hand was on my shoulder the whole time, and every page had both our names on it, side by side, equal. Anything else I should know about you? She asked again, echoing the question from 6 months earlier, a small smile on her face. Just that I'm proud of you, I said, for building something that actually matters. Robert's health continued to improve. He came out to Montana that summer for the retreat's official opening, walking slower than he used to but steady, leaning on a cane and on Diane's arm as they toured the finished cabins together. He stopped at the edge of the river, the same spot where Diane and I had stood months earlier, and looked out at the water for a long time. "Your grandfather built something here," he said to me, "whether he knew it or not. And you and my daughter just built something bigger on top of it. That's a rare thing, Walter. Most families spend their whole lives arguing over what to protect. You two figured out what's actually worth building." The retreat has been open for almost a year now. Claire volunteers there on her days off from the hospital, working with veteran families, and she tells me it's some of the most meaningful work she's ever done. Eleanor, of all people, has become one of the retreat's biggest advocates, hosting fundraising dinners at her house, the same dining room where she once tried to shrink me down to a pension statement. Deanne still runs her company, still closes deals worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. But she comes home earlier now, and some Fridays she drives out to Montana with me just to sit by the river and watch the veterans and their kids fish, the way I once fished with my father and the way I once fished with Claire. I think about that night in Eleanor's dining room sometimes, the folded paper in my jacket pocket, the silence that fell over the table when I finally spoke. I don't regret staying quiet as long as I did. It taught me something I needed to know about my wife, about her family, and honestly, about myself. But I also learned that love isn't proven by what you're willing to hide. It's proven by what you're willing to build together once everything is finally out in the open. Diane never asked what I owned before she married me. But she asks me now, every single day, in 100 small ways, what I think, what I need, what I'm carrying. And I've learned to answer honestly, because a marriage built on assumptions, even quiet, patient ones, is still a marriage built on sand. Ours is built on something steadier now. River water, family land. A retreat with both our names on the sign out front. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below, and if this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. There are more stories like this one waiting for you right here.